you all for coming to talk trash with us tonight. And I obviously couldn't resist that, but thinking about trash in the future of the city, it should be pretty exciting. The structure of tonight's event is that we're going to have a short presentation followed by a panel discussion, so it's sort of a two-part thing. And after the panel discussion, there'll be a lot of time for Q&A, so I hope you'll save up all your questions and dive in with them then. So I'm going to start by introducing our two presenters tonight, and also the two people whose real event, they're the real organizers of tonight's event. We're just piggybacking on their hard work. So Juliette Spertus is she's an architect, a writer, and a curator, and her work sort of looks at urban infrastructure and then the ways that different infrastructural systems are adopted and transformed over time. She is probably best known, at least to me, for her work as curating the exhibition Fast Trash, which I hope many of you had the chance to see when it was on Roosevelt Island in 2010. It was an exhibition all about the sort of history and possible futures for Roosevelt Island's pneumatic trash disposal system, the ADAC system there. And if you didn't get a chance to check it out, it lives online at fasttrash.org in a really kind of one of the more successful translations of offline exhibition to online exhibition, so definitely check it out. One of the most exciting things to come out of that exhibition is Juliette's current work with Benjamin Miller. Benjamin Miller works on freight and garbage policy. He's a senior research fellow at CUNY's Transportation Research Center, and the author of a book called Fat of the Land, which is the history of garbage in New York City. He's also working on another book right now on underground freight transport, so the two things merge here in an interesting way. And Ben became interested in pneumatic trash collection after seeing the exhibition last year. And now Juliette and Ben teamed up to work on two feasibility studies funded by the New York State Energy Research Authority. There's a Roosevelt Island study looking at expanding the existing pneumatic system in various ways there, to include residential recyclables and things like that. We'll hear about it. And then a Manhattan study for a pilot pneumatic tube system for the High Line. So Juliette and Ben are going to start the evening by giving us a sneak peek at their findings so far in terms of the feasibility study. And then we will be joined by Vishaan Chakrabarti, Claire Weisz, and Marcia Byrstryn for a discussion about the future of waste disposal in New York City. But I'll introduce them in more depth when we come to that part of the evening. So Juliette and Ben, take it away.
I think your clicker will do it.
Let's do it.
That's a particularly short microphone for it, so if you want to do it in wandering, sorry.
Use the other one.
Oh, use the other one. Not in the last century, there were countries in the Western world that had human waste removed this way. Oops. It's still removed this way from the tallest building in the world, Burj Khalifa in Dubai, where there are no sewers. So every day there are miles of these tanker trucks that come and suck sewage and then drive to a landfill and wait for days to unload. New York City, I'm very proud to say, has made real progress on this front. We've also made real progress in using the efficiency of pipes for moving people. Pipes for moving power is common in this country. Pipes for all sorts of applications are widespread in this country. Garbage, however, is a special case of inertia. Nothing has changed the last couple of 100 years except the containers we put it in and the vehicles we use for picking it up. Back in the day when we relied on coal and wood for our fuel, we had the ash can. And we got the trash can when we started burning oil and natural gas, and then plastic. came along. And, people don't realize that glad bags were born in New York. LDPE, low density polyethylene, was invented by two Canadian inventors during World War II. It was bought by Union Carbide in 1950. They figured out they could make bags. What do you do with a bag? Bags were made at that time of paper or burlap, and trash cans were made of metal. So the notion of making something you sold in a store to be thrown away was unheard of. So how do you create a market and do it in New York? You go to Broadway, the biggest stage in the world, and you do it there. So there's a strike in 1968, a sanitation strike. You couldn't buy the trash can. Bags were on the street. So down, and which came down, rained garbage bags out in the city. So it broke the door open a little bit. In 1969, there was a snowstorm. 1970, they succeeded. Lots of money flowing into the city council, flowing into various streams. They cracked it open, the law was changed. It had no law, you had a metal can. It's called the New York Experiment. The experiment was one community board in Queens, 2 months, let's give it a try. Everybody loved it. I made the problem much worse. When I was director of policy planning and sanitation for the first solid waste management plan for first recycling, said we love garbage bags, garbage guys do. Everybody loves garbage bags. We'll put all of it in garbage bags. Well, blue bags and clear bags. This had never been done before. The recycling programs that existed prior to then used little bins or boxes or containers like trash cans of plastic. So that's a pain. So we spent a lot of time in engineering money trying to figure out what do you do if you put metal, glass, and plastic inside one of these things and it goes up to a material recovery. So what do you do with that? So we spent time looking at flail knives to break them open and various kinds of equipment to tear open a bag. We invented the split compartment truck so we can compact these different materials on both sides of the truck. That's the way we figured out. This is the most cost-effective way for the city to do this. This is what it looks like on the commercial side. This is what a typical New York City street looks like. No one else in the world can believe this. And then we've got the problem, this system that I set up of sorting this stuff, sorting the clear bags, the black bags, and blue bags. It's all great. And of course we have rats, which hadn't happened like this before, and that's why there was a law against requiring you to use metal cans. And then after the stuff is picked up, it's taken by truck on the slowest roads in the country, and it's taken to a transfer station like this. They're in 2 parts of the town, and they're loaded from the transfer station into 23-ton trucks, and it runs through neighborhoods like this in Greenpoint. Now, some of our trash is now, residential trash is hauled away from Staten Island by rail. Some of it's hauled away from the Bronx by rail. And lately, we've started to haul some of the stuff, portion of the stuff from Brooklyn by rail. There's still enough trucks. I did this calculation before the Brooklyn thing came on, but it's roughly the same. There's still 917 of those 23-ton tractor-trailer trucks leaving the city every day, in addition to the trains. These tractor-trailer trucks are 75 feet long. If they're traveling at highway speed with a gap of 60 feet between them, by the time and they're running in the New York Marathon, the first one leaves the Verrazano Narrows Bridge and gets to mile 23. The last one is just leaving. That's equivalent. They drive the equivalent amount of miles and the trip, 192 trips to LA per day. This is what it looks like from air. This is our trucks spreading their tentacles out into landfills as far as eastern Ohio. These are our trains going down to Virginia and South Carolina. This is what we destroy every year with just the residential waste generated in New York City, 140 acres. The city people, this is what 140 acres looks like. The cost is going way up. I made this chart some time ago. The number is now up here. The fuel that we use is just for the export outside city limits compares rather favorably to the entire taxi fleet's fuel use. The emissions from just the export part is this blue thing down here. This is all of the greenhouse gas emissions generated by the electricity sold but not generated by Con Ed. This is how much greenhouse gas emissions comes from the trucks and trains that take it out once it leaves the city limits. And then this is what happens in the landfill. So our greenhouse gas emissions also compare favorably to what goes on with energy. Diesel trucks, of course, are a major source of particulate emissions. Particulate emissions are a major source of asthma, the leading cause of hospitalization in children. This is shows the volume of trucks on the truck routes in Brooklyn and Queens. This shows hospitalizations of children in Brooklyn and Queens. You see a reasonable match. Plan YC this time around finally took notice of the fact that the city's waste stream and its freight transportation system do contribute significantly to the city's greenhouse gas emissions, and the goal is to reduce the amount that goes into landfills. Plan YC says that recycling, particularly in multifamily buildings, is tough. It says that recovering organic material would be very nice, but difficult to do in high-rise buildings. It says that incentivizing waste reduction through economic measures would be nice, but is also difficult to do in high-rise buildings. It says that converting waste, rather than hauling it to South Carolina, using technologies such as anaerobic digestion and synthetic gasification equipment, would save a lot of money and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So this is a summary of all the waste-related things in New York City's Plan YC. Those little blue check marks are things that having a tube system would directly affect and improve. Juliette. We are in a great situation of having a pneumatic tube system in New York already.
So the question then is, how did Roosevelt Island get its pneumatic garbage system? First, I wanted to mention that we are lucky tonight to have Neil Gallagher, who is the Department of Sanitation Director of Building Maintenance, so the person who oversees all of the buildings for the Department of Sanitation, here with us tonight. And we also have Jerry Sargente, who is the Chief Engineer for the AVAC facility here tonight. So two experts. Roosevelt Island was originally called Welfare Island because it's where the city kept its hospitals, insane asylums, prisons, all of the things that it didn't want. Manhattan went to Welfare Island. But by the 1960s, all of those things except the hospitals had been transferred off the island, and it was basically empty, 147 acres, right next to the UN, right next to the Upper East Side, the last great tract of real estate for New York City, and the city didn't have the money to develop it. So New York State had just created the New York State Urban Development Corporation, an agency, a very progressive agency that had been set up to build housing for New York State, and had an impressive amount of power. It could ignore local zoning codes, it could write bonds, and they had a mandate for innovation. This is the cover of the catalog for announcing the UDC development. That was the master plan was designed by Philip Johnson, and he designed this catalog. The exhibit was shown at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1969. Roosevelt Island was supposed to provide a new town in town. It was going to have, it was going to be safe, it was going to be clean, it was going to be family friendly, and it wasn't going to have cars. So the question was how to build a city without cars. How do you bring in infrastructure for a development like this? And they hired engineers Gibbs and Hill to look at their infrastructure, and Gibbs and Hill recommended that they use a pneumatic garbage system for waste removal because it was the only system that was in keeping with the environmental goals of the island, notably being car-free. Of course, Roosevelt Island is no longer car-free, but the pneumatic system continues to run. So how does it work? This is a Gibbs and Hill diagram from 1971. First, you put your garbage in a garbage chute, a gravity-fed garbage chute like you would in any other high-rise building. And at the bottom of those garbage chutes, instead of a compactor, you have a valve, and that valve, those valves are opened to release the garbage. And the garbage runs into a 20-inch pipe which is like a sewer pipe that runs underground on the island. To actually collect the waste, first a vacuum is created by operating turbines which generate the vacuum. And once the vacuum, these are the turbines here, which are the original equipment. They're from 1975 and they're still in use. And this is Billy Dash, who is a Department of Sanitation oiler, changing the oil. So once those turbines are running, this is the control room, and you can. So the system is analog. It was designed not only before recycling but before computers, and it was designed to be automatic. So there are punch cards that would, would operate the system. The valves are opened one at a time once the vacuum is generated, and the whole process takes about 15 minutes. There, each valve opens, the garbage enters into the airstream, and all of that is controlled from this control room here. And the red tubes you see here is actually, these are the tubes carrying the garbage from underground on the island into the facility. And this is T.J. Kershaw, who is a Department of Sanitation engineer. Now, the system, like I said, was designed to be automatic with the punch cards. They then installed a computer later, but the engineers find that it's actually easier to run by hand. So that's what's happening here. Once the garbage comes back to the facility, it is separated from the air and filtered through these stacks in what's called a cyclone separator or a hopper. And here you can see another Department of Sanitation engineer, Lloyd Smith, who is demonstrating this here is the hopper, this cone, and so the garbage comes down this cone, and the air is then passes through these filters like a vacuum bag, and then it goes back into the back into the turbines, and then out through the stacks. So the air has to be very clean to go back to the stacks. And finally, it is compacted in a compactor. So the garbage never touches the air. It's going through this entirely closed vacuum system. And there it is, getting ready for pickup. So what about jams? That's always a question people want to know. What do you do when somebody puts their radio or their computer or their exercise equipment in the tube? And it does happen, and Jerry Sargenti is an expert. And this is Steve Mackauer, one of the Department of Sanitation machinists, showing the equipment that they've developed or selected over many years that's best adapted to removing these jams. And this equipment is basically like a sewer router, sewer jam removal. So they add these metal pieces are attached to essentially a roto-rooter, and they pull the garbage out. And so it doesn't happen that often, but when it does happen, that's what we do. And when there's a real problem, they call technicians from Sweden who are skinny and tall and willing to go into these tubes, and they can actually weld from the inside. One of the things that you don't really think about, but is that these tubes are quite clean. The air keeps them, from accumulating stuff, and so I don't think it would be fun to do, but apparently it's feasible. So the other question people have is, well, what does it cost to run the system? And the current 40-year-old system, the Model T Ford or the Chevrolet Impala, whatever you want to call it, costs about $2.3 million a year to operate. And the one of the big costs is electricity, for example, and a new, a typical new facility would use much less electricity, so you would save right there $150,000 a year just in electricity and 222 tons of greenhouse gases. So, as Nikki said, I got started with this when I organized the Fast Trash exhibit with Projects design firm, and so that's where we got the history, and this is an image of the exhibit on Roosevelt Island at the Riva Gallery, and you can see actually we were lucky enough to get pieces of a tube. Mary Sargenti and his team were very accommodating, and we had a panel discussion. It's because the exhibit was looking at the history of something that was so idiosyncratic and represented the past, and I was really interested, and I still am, in what, the possibilities for the future. And at that point, I was very much just trying to understand, is this a model or not? Why is ODS doing this? So we had this panel discussion, and at the panel discussion, I was there, but also Ben Miller was there, and Jonas Hornblom of NVAC. NVAC is the Swedish company that designed the Roosevelt Island system. And that's where we first started talking about, what could happen, what are the possibilities. And NVAC is sort of, as Ben likes to say, the Microsoft and the Apple of the pneumatic garbage world. They invented this technology 50 years ago, and they have offices and installations all over the world. This is an NVAC diagram, and it shows what a system looks like when you incorporate source-separated waste, like recyclables or organics, and basically what that means is that you still have one sewer, one trunk line, but you have different inlets, and the waste, the different fractions sit behind these valves, and then they are sent through the system at different times. So all of the recyclable valves will be opened in a sequence, and then they would be collected, and so on. So just to give you a little bit of an idea of what other cities are doing, Barcelona is a very good example for Manhattan, because it's a city that has looked at has retrofit areas, neighborhoods, and has also used pneumatic collection in new developments. And we are, Ben and I are interested in retrofitting Manhattan. So this is a map from Barcelona. Actually created a master plan for pneumatic waste, and they actually looked at all of the neighborhoods and districts in the city, and which districts does it make sense to include pneumatic collection, and what types of network should they do, what are the costs. So they did an exhaustive report, and one of those areas is the Gothic Quarter, and in particular, we're interested in this example, which is the Santa Caterina food market, and there is a pneumatic garbage collection facility 2 floors down underneath this very active food market, and it collects the waste for, at term it looked like the waste for 23,000 households, and it'll have 800 inlets connected to it. And here is an image of what these inlets look like in Barcelona. And what's interesting here is that there are inlets that are used both for residential and pedestrian waste, a small hole, but also for commercial waste, which is the square here. And that door is locked, and you open it with a key access, so everybody who is using it can be identified, and they can use larger bags. Now, these images here show the Roman ruins that were underneath this paving, and that had to be negotiated to put these tubes. So if they can do it, anybody can. And then here are some images again from NVAC showing the types of terminals that they've installed. And so what's interesting is that you can do it in a lot of urban conditions, not just markets, but also here's in a roundabout or under a bridge, inside a median of a large avenue. So there are a lot of possibilities, again, because this is an entirely sealed process. And again, from NVAC, another thing that's interesting about this technology is the possibility of doing what's called save as you throw or pay as you throw, a policy that's very effective for reducing the amount of waste. That, if you charge people based on what they actually throw out, the way that we meter water, for example, it's very effective and fair and saves money in the end. But it's almost impossible to do in dense urban environments. And there is the possibility with a tube system, with a network, where you have these inlets to create card access and to have businesses paid, but also potentially residents. So we think that's something that's very exciting. And so we, as Nikki mentioned, we have these two grants that we applied for and were funded for, which was very exciting. One looking at Roosevelt Island and the other looking at Manhattan. And this is the organization chart, and we asked that ISERTA give us one project manager, and we also asked that we treat these two together.
Yeah, just.
Okay. So just quickly to give you some of our preliminary, what we found. So basically, the first question with Roosevelt Island is, how much waste is the system collecting now? It's collecting 5.8 tons per day, just residential trash. So the question is, what else can we add? What other waste streams are out there, and what would that represent if we included them in the system? So residential recyclables currently, because the system was designed before recycling, are collected by hand and trucked to the facility. Business waste is collected in compactor trucks. Roosevelt Island itself, they own the system. They could take advantage of it for their facilities, and their park and litter bins could also be connected. We did a survey of the litter bins on the island. There are 172, 21 different kinds. We think this could be rationalized. There's also the hospitals. One of the hospitals is going to be removed from the island, but still there's another hospital which produces almost twice as much waste as the residential buildings. We think it could have its own facility if they wanted. It doesn't make sense to incorporate into an island-wide one. Now, Roosevelt Island is growing. There's a Four Freedoms Park that's being built on the tip of the island. There are 3 new residential towers that are going to go up in the next few years, and of course, there's a 2 million square foot new Cornell campus, which represents 4.5 tons per day of waste. So this is we have a lot to play with waste-wise. And what does that represent? It represents, if we took all the business waste and incorporated it into the system, that would be 8 compactor truck trips a day that would not go down Roseland's one narrow, winding street. 85 hours plus of waste handling that wouldn't be necessary, and 35 gallons of fuel. Roosevelt Island, these are minor compared to what happens in New York City, but they have a system, they might as well use it. There are also other sunk costs, like the recoverable space under containers and the space to access those containers. And it seems like not that much space, but actually It's more than just the actual square footage, it's the fact that it's sitting there in the public space. And then there's $300,000 in equipment and bins and vehicles and carts. And then there are the quality of life impacts, which again are nothing in comparison to Manhattan, but why not eliminate them completely? And finally, there's the question of organic waste. So other cities in the U.S., like Portland or Seattle or San Francisco, are collecting compost. It's very, very difficult to do in the dense urban environment from individuals, from residences. You just can't collect, you can't send enough trucks to collect this putrescible waste fast enough. But you can do it with tubes. These are inlets in Barcelona. And looking at all of the waste of Roosevelt Island, including the hospitals, future waste, there's about 7.3 tons per day of organic waste. This isn't enough to justify its own facility by itself, or its own facility like this. This is an aerobic digestion facility that would generate natural gas and compost, but well, it's a perfect time.
So the Roosevelt Island system is great and we made better, but not that many people on Roosevelt Island, there's not that much traffic congestion, there's not that much garbage. There is in Manhattan. This is where a system like this belongs. We have 4 different colored trucks hitting every block in Midtown. We could use some help. We know that it can be retrofitted. We've seen what happened in Barcelona and other cities, but wouldn't it be nice to use the cheapest, simplest, use existing infrastructure, linear infrastructure, just a hang or two instead of drilling new holes? We thought of this. We can hang them on the viaducts. There are lots of situations like this around town. The viaduct we like most is the High Line. One of the reasons we like the High Line most is because it ends around the Hudson Yards. We were focused on Hudson Yards from the beginning because the related companies own those last big high-rises on Roosevelt Island. As developers, they love it because you don't have to have a space for closets, for waste closets. You don't have to have porters involved. There are all the advantages. We figured there'd be a soft sell. We got our contract awards at the end of last year, but our contract wasn't signed until the end of March. Jay Cross, the president, beat us to the punch and said, I want to tube up this system. It's 26 acres, it'll be 2 downtown Seattle's. We love this place because it's going to be built over a rail yard on a deck. So we could stick the garbage containers smack on rail and shoot it up the Empire line. Never needs to hit a truck. We could also, this deck, put anaerobic digesters, a plasma gas bag. We could process it right on site. 2 downtown Seattle's, never leave that truck. This could be transformative scale. This could be like Glad bags. So now we'd like to expand it south. With the High Line. So this is the related company's website before we even started saying we're tubing up. This is today, this is tomorrow. This could be Glad bags, and this is what we'd like to add to it. We'd like to snake south on the High Line. This is what the High Line looks like now. They use the old-fashioned system, and they take it by hand and they drop it down on the streets all by hand. Unsightly and manual, but it's not very much garbage, about 1.25 tons a day, not really much worth bothering about. What we'd be interested in is all the garbage around it. If we could hang our sewer tube underneath it, let's say, ideally on top, so that you could make it in plexiglass tubes, and you see the food waste going through, and you see the metal glass, you hear the whir like a little brook, and it's sort of tacked down in the shrubbery, and then it turns into gas, and then you use the compost. A lot of people said no. We want it underneath. It's okay, we'll make it plexiglass and have big low arrows, and this is, we'll paint it High Line green, that black color. Okay. But once we put that tube there, where are we going to get the garbage from? There are lots of places you can imagine getting lots of garbage in that part of the world. This is kind of soft spot. There's going to have a building there sometime. If we get a trunk running underneath it, boom, the Standard Hotel. The Caledonia, or even these old buildings. We could stick a tube right down the hallway and out the window if we wanted to. They do that sort of thing in other places. We could grab stuff from the street. So these old-fashioned garbage cans, we can just angle it up. So as long as we're at 17% or less grade, we can get garbage there. But the easiest garbage of all we get is from the Chelsea Market. It runs smack through there. This is a block-walled complex. that generates over 10 tons of garbage a day, we believe, just by eyeballing it. That is the lowest hanging fruit in the whole High Line. And if that's not enough, but it would be, it's also connected physically to all these other buildings. This is what the Chelsea Market looks like. The High Line goes right through it. This is the first floor of the High Line. I think Chelsea Market looking east. We think it might be possible to hang a tube there. This is looking west. We think it might be possible to hang a tube there. We don't know yet, and this is just an idea. If we did, we could strap the tube right along the side of the High Line here in places like this. Places like this can't do that unless this is knocked over. What we do instead is we stick the tube, it's only 20 inches, smack in between these I-beams, snip, snip, those little struts. So what we're planning to do is hand the report to the Roosevelt Island Corporation sometime this year, after we've had a chance to coordinate with Cornell and say, spending a lot of money now, you've got a 40-year-old Chevrolet and needs some repair anyway. What's the smartest way to take this as far as we can go? A similar report we will hand to the powers that be at the High Line. It's more complicated there. The Carter's involved and so on. Hand them the report and say, these are the costs and benefits, these are the savings, what do you think? Phase 2 is, we'll build the first one. Phase 3 is, once we've got our tubes there, we'll drop more garbage in and we'll replicate our success. We can do it in the High Line, we can do it on the viaduct 125th Street, where the subway comes out running down Broadway between those new Columbia buildings. We can do it under the Coney Island Boardwalk. We can think of lots of places where we can just replicate that, including the subways. System 4 is, then once everyone has seen this, the glad bag thing, city planning will say, you want a new building? Get me a sewer permit, get me a tube permit. This is the way we do things in New York.
Well, so now to discuss and debate this future vision trash, we have 3 panelists joining Juliette and Ben. So, come on up, folks. I feel like a game show hostess now. Okay. I'll start with furthest away from me. We have Vishaan Chakrabarti, colleague of ours at Columbia University Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, where he is the Marc Holliday Professor of Real Estate and the Director of the Real Estate Development Program. And through his own firm, he continues to consult on the urban design effort for Hudson Rail Yards, which you were just looking at. So, from 2002 to 2005, Chakrabarti served as Director of the Manhattan office for the New York City Department of Planning. So that involved working with Mayor Bloomberg and his team, offering advice on all urban planning issues throughout Manhattan, including gaining approvals for a lot of the most kind of the biggest redevelopments and rezonings on the west side, including the area around the High Line. So that's Vishaan. Next to him we have Marcia Byrstryn, President of the New York League of Conservation Voters since 2008, previously Executive Director there. And the League's mission, it's a statewide mission to elect strong environmental candidates to office and to then hold them accountable once they're in office. And then her garbage credentials, as it were.
There are many.
Everyone, think about your own garbage credentials now. Marcia's garbage credentials as Senior Business Manager for Economic Development at the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. She oversaw the development of new business opportunities in regional solid waste management. Sounds intriguing. And she was also Assistant Commissioner for Recycling at New York City's Department of Sanitation, where she designed and implemented the city's recycling program. And then finally, closest to me, Claire Weisz, an architect and a founding partner of New York design firm WXY Architecture and Urban Design, as well as a founding board member of the Design Trust for Public Space. Also many garbage credentials, including with her firm, she's responsible for the plan for the city's new marine terminal recycling facility, the Hugo Marine Terminal Recycling Facility. as well as working on a proposal by City Green for a biogas facility in the produce market. So, hold on, I'm going to give you this.
Right.
And I'd actually like to start with a very general question for each of you, sort of specifically for our, not you guys, but you guys, specifically in your field. How do you deal with or think about solid waste? How do you encounter it? How do you interact with it? Where does it come up in your fields?
I have the mic, so if everyone can hear me. So I'll, as an architect,
Sorry.
wearing the sort of architectural hat, in addition to some of the planning credentials on both sides and urban design, we're architects for this new Spring Street garage with Datner and Salt Shed, which is an example of how you have to, a place you have to store all those trucks, and they're extremely expensive facilities. So not only when you think about buildings and storage, as Manhattan gets more and more development pressure, people don't want to park the trucks anywhere, and they don't want to maintain, there's a huge demand on space, maintenance space for the Department of Sanitation, for the Department of Transportation. And I think that the debates, and there were many when it came to Spring Street, about how the demands of city infrastructure, so one can imagine in a building, right? So every time, whether we're designing a school or looking at residential buildings, the garbage room, like just providing a large enough garbage room, or even in Battery Park City, which happens to have a compactor program. So just finding a space. We spent about 3 months a couple of years ago looking for space for the Battery Park City Parks Conservancy to find space for compactors because no one had enough space in their building. So I think in general there's this huge pushback on anyone on the physical design side that there's no room anywhere.
Great.
Terrific. From the perspective of the League, solid waste is a public policy issue. And it's a public policy issue at every level of government. But here in New York City, we've been very interested in taking a look at how the city manages the non-recyclable fraction of solid waste. And in fact, we had a forum a month or two ago, and the question posed what is the most environmentally sound and economically friendly way of managing the non-recyclable fraction of solid waste. And I think everyone realizes that the current system, as Ben pointed out in his presentation, not only has very serious environmental impacts, but is becoming increasingly more expensive. So the question is, what are the alternatives? And I come at it from that perspective. I think it's really important when you take a look at any solid waste management solution, not to look at it in isolation, but to look at it in comparison with what the other options are, and to look at them both in terms of, from my organization's perspective, the environmental and the economic impacts. So it was interesting when you were sort of talking about where you run your tubes, and some people are sort of with, well, we don't want to tube there, but if you take a look at what the option is for not having a system like that, you have more trucks on the street, you have unsightly solid waste containers. So it's I just urge everyone to take a look at the comparative benefits of the various systems of solid waste management.
Yeah, I would like to. I'd like to build upon both of those comments in the sense that if you look at it at a macro level, right, the facility that Claire is designing, for instance, right, that they not only cost hundreds of millions of dollars, presumably. How much?
$330 million.
$330 million, right? But then you think about the value of the land that that's sitting on, right? And then you think about the neighborhood that that is in, right? And what, sort of the instant, more sort of conservative response to a presentation like what we just saw is, well, how much would that cost? I mean, to retrofit Manhattan, isn't that, it's unthinkable. But what we don't think about is what is the comparative trade-off, right, in terms of looking at it and saying, well, and I know this isn't quite where we are in terms of the system, but if you could eliminate the trucks, and you could eliminate so many of these facilities that now occupy all this land and occupy all these facilities, not to mention the labor involved, and that's a political issue at some level, right? That the cost of that is billions of dollars ultimately, right? And that has to be enough to run some plastic tubing through our subway system, right? And so, I think that the problem we sometimes face is this sort of lack of imagination in terms of truly understanding the cost-benefit analysis associated with something like this. Now, I know we're still a long way from talking about eliminating all the trucks, but it seems to me that should clearly be the end goal here. And I would actually think that environmentalists and the public sector and the private sector would all have very common alignment in trying to do this.
Well, so then that said, given the proposal that we just looked at, I'd love to hear from as many of you as would like to answer, what does it take to make something like that happen? Who needs to be on board? How do you get them on board? And who do you need to convince, and how do you do it to make something like that happen?
Just a quick comment. One of the beauties of this kind of system, unlike any other kind of garbage system that Marcia and I have ever been involved with when we were in sanitation, this can be tiny. This is inherently modular because we're talking about air. So we're talking about tubes that are 1.5 miles long, max. We're talking about terminals that are the size of an apartment or two stuck together. They could be anywhere in a building, up above, down below. They can handle about 18 tons. That's the capacity of a set of fans, just because that's how much stuff you can pull through a tube. So they're modules that are relatively cheap, and you can pop them together like Legos. This truly can be incremental, and that means you start with, in my view, the lowest hanging fruit, new developments. Greenfield, all the new developments, just go do it. You want a building permit? This is what we do nowadays. You want a variance? You want incentive zoning? We focus on the big bang new developments, like the Cornell campus, like the Columbia campus, like Hudson Yards, like new areas going up around the High Line, like new areas going up when we knock over the Javits Center, and the Low Line connects along there. We want to hang a tube right into that new part. We can start step by step and then rationalize it someday the way Barcelona did, the way Stockholm did. Once we got enough of these Lego pieces, then let's hook them together.
So I do have one question for you. Right now, we have 2 different systems for our residential waste, that's essentially a public system, and then we have a privatized system. So I think it's amazing to think about whether it's Hudson Square or Hudson Yards, anything both above a deck or that you're building at one time, or building infrastructure for doing this. But how do you catalyze, maybe it's more of a question for you, but how do you take what seems to be now the greatest, it's so dirty, those systems. Those are the trucks you can't really control. It feels like that's where a place like Hunts Point really feels the pain, is in the private waste haulers.
Oh, well, that's the beauty of this system, is it doesn't matter to us. This is a sewer, and we know exactly who is putting it in, exactly how much, where it's coming from, and we can apportion the costs as well. So it's perfect. It solves that problem of having 4 different colored trucks hitting every block in Midtown, plus a white garbage truck. We just have a sewer, and we know exactly how much to charge all of these players, and it's the perfect definition of public-private partnership. No one's imagining that private carriers are going to go away. They'll be involved. And we've been talking to some, and believe me, the surprising reaction is this is very interesting. There's money to be saved, and then we just divide up how the savings go. So that's the beauty of this system, is we can monitor it.
And I just wanted to reiterate what you said. I mean, how do you practically move this ahead? You do move it ahead on a modular basis. And I think that there are tremendous opportunities, I would suspect, with new development in this city. You have a lot of requirements now for new development that have to do with energy generation and a host of other things. You already have sort of models for a new set of expectations. And I think what you have to set, I think you probably have an interest, certainly in parts of the development community already, I'm moving on that. But at the same time, I think if you have the right administration, and perhaps this administration is the right one at the moment, where you can begin to put a regulatory system in place which creates additional incentives. If it's not mandates immediately, there are incentives that are put in place to encourage this kind of thing. And I think that's probably the best way to build it. And, you know, quite frankly, this is not something you're going to do overnight in terms of totally transforming the city. But I think you can get a critical mass moving on this sooner than we probably
Glad
think.
bags.
Glad bags.
And then Vishaan, also, I would love to hear what you say on this, but also, I guess then who or what also are the obstacles would be interesting.
Well, again, I think that the cost issue is probably, the upfront cost is probably the most significant question, and I think you do have to work with a balance of requirements and incentives. A large development project, you know, every square inch counts, and so if suddenly you're talking about introducing a shaft through a tall tower, for instance, I would argue that shouldn't count towards zoning floor area. It's a very technical issue, but it's a relatively simple issue in terms of how to deal with some of the cost problems that you're going to confront in the first instance. And I just think generally, I agree, new development is the right place to begin, and especially sort of large, sort of master plan development. But to me, if I could sort of take it up one more step in the conversation and sort of leave New York, I forbid a little bit, you know, what's so fascinating to me about the topic is the extent to which it's really contingent on density, right? I mean, if you think about the way most of America lives, this is not really that viable a solution, it seems to me, if people want to live in single-family homes. The more diffuse we are in our landscape, the harder this is to pull off. It's probably doable, but I would imagine much, much more difficult and much less cost-effective. And so it's interesting, I would just, as a note, just in terms of, you're talking about implementation and the politics of something like this. I don't know if you caught it a couple of weeks ago, there's this, I think it was last week, this article on the front page of the Times about how the Tea Party has now sort of started to look at, as a platform, these green projects, and how this is actually all code for this crazy Marxist centralized takeover of America, and we all want people to ride in subways, God forbid. But there is this sort of, the more systemic things need to be in order to be more sustainable, and density is clearly the most sustainable thing. It's interesting to me how even your slide about the 21 different garbage cans on Roosevelt Island and how, well, couldn't we rationalize that? Well, isn't that big government telling you what kind of garbage can you can use? I mean, there's something really fascinating to me about the fact that this does require a faith in systemic thinking that has a political obstacle to it that we need to confront if we're going to try to do things like this.
I think, I think it's not an accident that the Roosevelt Island system was built in 1970, and the only other systems in the United States, well, the only other comparable system is actually Disney World. And there's one more system. Disney
that
World
Marxist Walt Disney.
Another system built by HUD, an experimental project in Jersey City, and then nothing else. And it's not by accident, you know. And this technology was taken up and was developed in Europe, where there is a much more faith in a centralized system, and now in Asia and in the Middle East. And so I think that we do have to be creative, and Ben and I have identified that New York is the place to start in the U.S., but certainly it is, in a way, an anti-American concept.
I think that's funny. Is you know, this is a panel full of pneumatic tube lovers, clearly, but I am curious as to whether that is shared among your compatriots, you know, in your field. So, do developers kind of universally either even know or always see the benefits of pneumatic tubes, and are environmental folks unified on this issue? Do architects know about the options? Do they do they even think about trash? Transportation, similarly. I'm curious as to whether it's like climate change and people don't actually agree.
Well, let me just jump right in. I mean, I don't think the environmental community is either particularly familiar with pneumatic tubes, and if in fact they are, have passionate feelings one way or another. But what they do have passionate feelings about, and this is a question of how do you sort of catalyze the issue in a way that captures people's imagination. To me, this has a tremendous potential to capture people's imagination if managed well. But what environmentalists care about is they care about truck congestion because of air impacts. They care tremendously about the impacts on communities of that kind of management of waste and transfer stations, which are the real blight of environmental justice communities across the city. They care very much about the air impacts of various kinds of disposal capacities. They care about a more effective recycling program, which this has the potential, if done well, to be able to segregate material in a more intelligent way. So it's not so much they care about pneumatic tubes, but they recognize they have a problem in the way solid waste is managed, and so the real challenge is to get them to see this as a potential solution.
I think it's fun, too, to think about what do architects think about. I mean, in general, if you had a tube system, you would be able to have more square footage and more to do things that are above the street that were interesting, right? I think the big issue, if you imagine this citywide, is where are those rooms where the garbage ends up? And if I was going to push on a micro level as opposed to on the macro level, the other thing is why aren't we finding ways to actually not then put it in rail cars? If there's no reason, right, that we can't kind of plug this into smaller actual waste, energy to waste facilities that are neighborhood specific. I mean, in general, you see these sweet neighborhoods in Sweden where people have little recycling centers for streets and blocks. And New York, wonderfully, is so dense that we actually produce a massive amount that maybe will produce a massive amount of energy. We actually could do more in this city in terms of we could have the cheapest energy in the country. So it does feel like we have to use our density. We have to use trash more as a commodity and not just look at this pneumatic system like we're now going to give it away to Virginia and send it off. If we could, I'm sure there would be more jobs if we could figure out how to basically plug it in on our end in a reliable way. Maybe that's way too futuristic.
No.
Yeah, I mean, I think the development community doesn't think about pneumatic tubes at all. And when confronted with this, I mean, look, there are companies that are more sophisticated, obviously, the Durst organization related, a number of others. But, I think when confronted with this, they're going to have to deal with the ultimate consequence of what happens when it doesn't work, right? I mean, and I love the picture of the guy with the tools. That was the best. I still want to know the chain with the cross. Interesting one. But, I think that's one of the first questions a developer is going to ask is, this is now part of my building. Does it really work? Does the system back up? Does it cause problems for my tenants, et cetera, right? So there's a series of pragmatic issues. But I do think the development community at large is concerned about many of the same issues that have been cited. Could we get waste to energy facilities? We have a horrible power problem in front of us in the city. That there are health problems, noise problems, all sorts of problems associated with the current system. And I think people are very aware of that.
One thing that I would like us to get to is, and you all have kind of hinted at it in various ways, but this question of what the city might look like if we moved trash differently, and I guess on a similar note, actually. Well, I'm going to back up from that question because I write a lot about food. And so always end up thinking about urban agriculture. And the thing that people say about urban agriculture is, it could never feed the city. Like it could never feed the whole city. And what the urban agriculture people who are smart always say, yes, it's not meant to. That's not actually the goal here. We're not going to take over the whole food system and just feed it through urban agriculture. But I am curious about how far this could go in New York City, and what are the limits? Like, what neighborhoods would it not work in? What areas are just simply not amenable to a pneumatic tube system? What are the limits?
Well, I mean, there are whole neighborhoods of New York that are single-family homes, and obviously those areas wouldn't make sense to switch to a system like this. But you could imagine that New York City could have a master plan like Barcelona does, and we could identify and do the cost-benefit analysis for all of its cities. But the other thing that's interesting is these systems have a range of about 1.5 miles. And New York, in Manhattan, is how wide is it? It's less than 2 miles wide. So you could imagine that you wouldn't need that many of these terminals to cover the densest area of the city.
So there are just some neighborhoods that are single-family homes that you couldn't do, but otherwise we could.
I think it's a question of what's cheapest. Clearly, the cheapest is new development. We could do everywhere in the city that is densely populated. It gets more and more difficult when you have an old masonry building. You're not going to stick tubes inside that, but you would have kiosks outside, just as they do in Europe. On Park Avenue, where you have these high-rise structures with hanging faces with central utility cores. You can imagine retrofitting some of that. So just a question of prioritizing by cost is the way I would suggest it. We could do the whole city except single-family areas. And even single-family areas could be done as they are sometimes.
Yes, one thing I wanted to add, which something we've actually come across in our research and our study on Roosevelt Island is the question: if, for example, these new recycling to incorporate residential recyclables on Roosevelt Island will mean having outdoor kiosks for the recyclables, because we're not going to retrofit those buildings. So in Europe, for example, people are used to carrying their recyclables or their garbage and depositing it outside. So I guess the point I want to make is there's a paradigm shift that's required, and some would say, well, that's too much to ask. But I would say, well, everybody is anxious to recycle now. If you ask somebody in the 50s to sort through their trash for you, they would think you were crazy. And so I think that there are, those kinds of paradigm shifts are obstacles, but also opportunities.
And so one other thing that I'm kind of curious about is in your experience in other cities, are there other solutions that we're not thinking about? Is it always like a tube versus truck paradigm here? And are there other systems out there? The idea of taking rather than putting a bag on the sidewalk, there's the bin on the sidewalk, but that still requires a truck. Are there other models?
I mean, I don't know of any. I mean, I think the thing that really I found, I think I knew it, but you drove it home. It is amazing how in the area of trash management, nothing has changed for hundreds of years. I mean, it's
the containers have changed.
The containers. All that's changed are the containers. That you put it out in some, mode of transportation, then moves it to someplace. I think there's rather than talking about what the limits of this are, I mean, I think there's been a real failure of imagination in thinking about solid waste, and the fact that none of us can really think of interesting and fascinating and novel ways that other places are handling waste tells you a lot. So, I mean, I think this is a real sphere for those innovative people in this room to direct their attention.
I'll bring up a couple of examples, though.
Oh, she's got this. She knows.
Well, in New York City in particular, there are many people who, go drop off their compost at farmers markets, especially via the Lower East Side Ecology Center. And in general, people do it in restaurants, in fact, are willing to compost too if they can connect to a system. Equally in Battery Park City, if people here who live in a doorman building, they put it down the chute, but someone in their building, the laborers are still taking it from the room to the corner. No one is the sanitation is not coming in to pick up their trash. So someone is still doing that movement. So I think it's a matter of just being more obvious that is still happening. It's a question of who's doing it. Many people in brownstones take out their garbage. They take out their recyclables to the curb. So if they were going out to the street and could put them not in a plastic garbage bag, but to literally something half a block up or down. In other words, if it was part of the street infrastructure, wouldn't that be the same for most people who take out their garbage, either recyclables certain days? And in Battery Park City, there's a number of buildings. I think there's 21 buildings, 17 are part of the compactor program. It means that those people in those buildings, the doormen, the handymen, still have to take the garbage, but they take it to a closed compactor, which is very similar to people taking it. So part of the new New York, right, or the new Manhattan would be all of a sudden you'd see some well-designed, different kind of tubes on streets that would replace regular garbage cans. So people in Times Square you wouldn't have like a bad-looking garbage can. You would basically have more tubes that you would throw your stuff into. So I'm not sure that it's socially that different than what actually happens now, except that people don't think about it if they're in a larger building. And now in a larger building, you wouldn't need the labor to actually move the garbage from one point to the other.